There are days in Rome when the wind carries more than the scent of stone and incense. It carries whispers. Whispers of a church about to change. For weeks, the eternal city had hummed with rumors, 10 reforms, they said. Reforms so bold they could fracture centuries of tradition. Reforms so sweeping they might mend what was broken, or break what was whole. And now, the world had gathered to witness the truth of it. Inside the Vatican press room, ancient marble met modern glass. Rows of journalists pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices low, their pens ready. The air itself seemed weighted, as though unseen forces watched alongside them. At the room's center stood Marco Salvetti, sharp-eyed, silver-tongued, and merciless. A veteran of Vatican intrigue, he had exposed bishops, humbled cardinals, and delighted in the dance of scandal. Today, he aimed higher. For before him now walked a solitary figure, Pope Leo XIV. No escort. No notes. Only the white of his cassock and the shadow of conviction in his gaze. Behind him, a single man followed, Cardinal Tagle. His face unreadable. His heart, unknown. They took their seats beneath the towering papal seal, its gilded keys gleaming beneath cold lights. Marco's voice cut the air first, measured, polite, but sharpened to pierce. Your Holiness. The world watches today in confusion and concern. 10 reforms. They say you intend to rewrite the Church itself. Tell us. Do you come to preserve the faith, or to dismantle it? A hush fell. Pens stilled. Even cameras seemed to hold their breath. Pope Leo XIV regarded the room, not with defiance, nor with fear, but with a calm forged beyond applause or condemnation. His eyes, deep wells of experience, met the challenge without flinching. And in that long silence, before the first word left his lips, the air shifted. They thought they had cornered him. They thought they would expose him. But the answer Pope Leo XIV was about to give, would leave the entire Vatican speechless. Subscribe now to God's Message for Souls. Comment below where you're watching from, and prepare your heart, for what you are about to witness. The silence that followed Marco Salvetti's challenge was not empty. It throbbed, with history, with power, with the weight of 1 billion souls who looked to Rome for constancy in a shifting world. Yet in that silence, one man remained unmoved. Pope Leo XIV. The man they once called the shepherd of war-torn lands, had stood in ruins where no cameras dared follow. As a young priest, he had cradled orphan children beneath crumbling cathedrals in Syria, whispered prayers in burnt chapels in Nigeria, and heard confessions from soldiers who no longer believed in innocence. He had seen what the modern world had done to faith, how comfort bred complacency, how division poisoned the gospel, how shadows crept into the very heart of the Church. And so, long before this day, alone beneath the flickering lamp of his study, Leo XIV had begun to write 10 reforms, each a blade forged to cut through the tangled thorns of spiritual decay. Not to please an age obsessed with progress. Not to please an age obsessed with tradition. But to call the Church back to its first love, and its first cost. Few knew the full extent of his vision. One who did not, until days before this broadcast, was Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. Tagle, revered across continents, the voice of gentle orthodoxy. He had wept with the poor, defended the unborn, preached with tenderness. Yet his heart beat with caution. Change, to him, was a thing to be cradled slowly, lest the vessel shatter. When word reached him of the coming announcement, and of reforms that would shake ancient pillars, his heart had not stilled since. Now, he sat in the front row, eyes shadowed with uncertainty, rosary clutched beneath his robe. A friend of Leo's. But now a silent observer in a moment that could divide them forever. Across the chamber stood Marco Salvetti. If the Church had its shepherds, Marco was its wolf. An investigative journalist whose pen had humbled archbishops, unseated corrupt financiers, and sold headlines to a world hungry for the Vatican's missteps. To Marco, today was not about faith. It was about power, and those foolish enough to wield it against the tides of politics and modern expectation. He did not fear Leo XIV. He pitied him, a relic clinging to absolutes in an age of compromise. And before millions now watching across the globe, Marco intended to make that clear. The cameras were live. The seals of the Vatican gleamed under harsh studio lights. And beneath it all, beneath the whispered prayers, beneath the poised pens, history waited. For this was no mere press conference. It was the unveiling of 10 reforms that would either renew the bride of Christ, or tear the robe from her shoulders. A trembling church. A bold pope. A watching world. And the hour had begun. If you believe the church must face hard truths, not hide from them, then subscribe now to walk this path with us. But if you still won't, what fears are you shielding behind your silence? Write them below. The light awaits. The first flicker of movement came from Marco Salvetti. His voice, smooth, urbane, calculated, rose to fill the expectant air. Your Holiness, he began, the faintest smile tracing his lips, why risk dividing the church with so many changes at once? He leaned slightly forward, as if speaking to an aged patriarch who had perhaps lost touch with the pulse of the world. His words were wrapped in civility, but beneath them pulsed the familiar blade of skepticism. A murmur rippled through the gathered press corps, pens hovered, cameras refocused. It was the question everyone had waited to ask. Pope Leo XIV did not shift in his seat. His gaze, steady as the stone beneath St. Peter's, met Marco's without strain or indulgence. For a breath, silence held, charged not with uncertainty, but with clarity yet unspoken. Then came the reply, measured and unhurried, as though spoken not merely for the room, but for ages yet to come. True unity, Leo said, voice resonant, is built on truth, not fear. The words seemed to fall with weight, echoing softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. A subtle stir passed through the room. Some scribbled furiously, others glanced toward their screens. Yet the eyes of many, drawn by something deeper than the political theater, remained fixed on the man who had spoken. Behind the Pope, Cardinal Tagle sat with hands clasped upon his lap, fingers gently tightening. The words had struck something within him. Loyalty warred with caution. He had served popes before, counseled patience in an impatient world. But this tone, this resolve, was different. Leo was not posturing. He was not maneuvering. He believed. And with that belief, Tagle sensed, would come consequences no one yet dared to name. At the front, Marco's smile held, polite, unfazed, but the sharpness of his gaze betrayed a mind recalculating. He had expected a defensive pope. A weary one. Instead, he had met a man prepared to stake unity itself upon the altar of truth. And the undercurrent in Leo's voice spoke what no words had yet revealed. This was only the beginning. If you believe that unity without truth is no unity at all, subscribe now, and walk with us as this path unfolds. But if you still won't, tell us below, what part of this truth unsettles you most? The smile that lingered on Marco Salvetti's lips now sharpened, as if honed by the Pope's unflinching reply. The room, sensing a shift beneath the civility, leaned in. Marco's tone turned cool, deliberate. Your Holiness, he said, voice pitched for the millions now watching, forgive the bluntness, some say these reforms are less about truth, and more about pandering to modern trends. To curry favor with a restless world. Is it not dangerous to trade the eternal for the popular? A hush followed, pregnant with expectation. At the dais, Pope Leo XIV inclined his head, not in deference, but as one pausing to draw from deeper waters. When he spoke, his voice bore no defensiveness. Only the quiet authority of a man who had buried his certainty in the soil of human suffering. I do not trade, Leo said softly. Nor do I pander. I have stood in churches whose walls bled from bombs. I have knelt beside mothers who held the lifeless bodies of their children. I have heard the gospel whispered by those whose voices were breaking, not in triumph, but in need. He let the word settle, the weight of unseen graves pressing upon the polished marble of the Vatican. Holiness, he continued, gaze steady, must be lived, not theorized. A stir of unease swept through the room. Marco's poised expression faltered for the briefest instant. Yet Leo pressed on, not in haste, but with the cadence of a shepherd revealing hard truths to a weary flock. The Church cannot remain adorned in gold while her people starve for justice. Nor can she shield sin behind sacred vestments. His voice deepened. And so today, before the eyes of the world, I declare these first steps. A pause, measured, deliberate, as if allowing the walls themselves to lean closer. First, total transparency in the finances of the Vatican. No account shall be hidden. No ledger veiled. The bride of Christ must be clothed in light. A ripple passed through the room. Reporters stiffened. Pens raced. Leo's gaze did not waver. Second, a new and binding moral accountability for all clergy. No rank shall shield sin. No collar shall excuse corruption. The days of silence are ended. The word struck with the force of a bell tolling in the heart of the Church. And then, calmly, as though pronouncing a litany, third, mandatory pastoral service in the poorest regions for all bishops. No bishop shall govern without having first served where the need is greatest. The shepherd must smell of his sheep. Silence fell. In the front row, Cardinal Tagle's hands tightened. His breath caught. Not from disapproval, but from the sudden, unyielding vision laid bare. He had known Leo to be bold. But this was a laying of axe to root. The Church would not be the same. And in his heart, the Cardinal felt both the tremor of fear, and the ember of hope. Above them, the cameras rolled. The world listened. And though Marco Salvetti prepared his next barb, something in his eyes betrayed a flicker, of respect, or perhaps of caution. For the man before him was no pawn of modernity. He was a voice risen from the ruins of the faithful. If you believe that the Church must be clothed in light and service, not shadow and privilege, then subscribe now to walk this path of awakening. But if you still won't, tell us below, what truth here do you fear might cost you most? The silence that had followed Pope Leo XIV's third declaration hung heavier than the marble columns that framed the room. Yet in that pause, it was not surrender that settled over Marco Salvetti, but resolve. He leaned forward now, his voice cutting through the fragile hush with sharpened edge. Your Holiness, he said, slower now, each word honed to pierce, some would call this, dismantling. Are you not, let us speak plainly, undermining centuries of sacred tradition? The challenge rang clear, deliberate, an accusation drawn from the deepest well of resistance. Not only in the journalist's mind, but in the minds of many now watching across the globe, bishops, priests, faithful, who feared that beneath the language of renewal lay the hands of demolition. Eyes turned once more to the man in white. Pope Leo XIV did not recoil. Nor did he meet the charge with the cold precision of a politician. He breathed once, deeply, as one drawing upon the wells of both history and the spirit. Then he spoke, voice rich with the authority of centuries, yet tender as a father's counsel. Tradition, Leo said, gaze steady, is the roots. He let the word settle, not rushed, not defensive. But truth, he continued, voice now deepened with conviction, is the fruit. A stillness swept the chamber. Even Marco, sharpened for debate, found no immediate retort. Leo's eyes swept the room, not in triumph, but in invitation. The root must nourish the tree. But if no fruit comes forth, if what we bear cannot feed the world, then the root has become but a relic, a memory of life once given. The weight of the words seemed to press upon every heart present. And with that, the Pope rose. Not from his seat, but in stature, as though a new mantle had settled upon his shoulders. In that spirit, he said, voice resonant, here the next steps we must take, not to abandon our roots, but to bear fruit worthy of our calling. A pause. Then, the litany resumed. Fourth, the convening of regular ecumenical councils with other Christian leaders. No longer shall we walk divided when the gospel calls us to be one body. A murmur rippled through the press. Centuries-old lines of division shuddered at the words. Fifth, the creation of a new global council on safeguarding children. Every diocese, every nation, one standard, one unwavering shield for the innocent. A visible shiver moved through the room. Some heads bowed. Others stiffened. The shadow of past failures loomed large, and now, a light was being demanded to pierce it. Sixth, the appointment of lay women to key theological commissions. For wisdom is not bound by ordination, nor is the Spirit confined to one voice. Gasps now. Pens faltered. This was ground few dared tread. Yet Leo pressed on, unshaken. Seventh, the establishment of annual global interfaith peace prayer assemblies. In a world torn by hate, the Church must lead, not with weapons, but with witness. He fell silent then, allowing the weight of his words to seep deep into the stone and bone of the room. At the front, Cardinal Tagle sat motionless. Save for one movement. His right hand, trembling now, found the rosary concealed beneath his robe. Fingers clasped it, not in resistance, nor in calculation, but in prayer. For what he had heard surpassed debate. It reached to the heart of calling, of purpose. And in that moment, Luis Antonio Tagle was no longer a cardinal weighing policy. He was a son of the Church, listening with trembling hope to the voice of a shepherd unafraid to lead. The air remained thick with the unspoken. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The Pope had not defended against tradition, he had called it forth into life. And before the next question could rise, the world already knew, this was no dismantling. It was a reckoning. If you believe that the roots of tradition must feed the living fruit of truth, subscribe now, and stand with those who seek a church that breathes anew. But if you still won't, what fruit are you unwilling to see? Write it below. The tree must yet bear witness. But Marco Salvetti was not yet finished. The air still quivered with the shock of the Seventh Reform, with words that had drawn gasps and tightened brows across the global Church. Yet the seasoned journalist leaned forward again, eyes sharp, voice rising, not in curiosity, but in final attempt to wound. Your Holiness, he pressed, each syllable deliberate, you risk alienating both conservatives and liberals alike. Who, then, will remain to follow you? A murmur echoed through the room. No longer the confident rustle of earlier banter, but a more subdued sound. The question was not small. It hovered beneath the surface of every watching heart. Would the Church fracture beneath the weight of such change? Would the ancient vessel splinter beneath a modern tide? But Pope Leo XIV did not blink. His face remained as it had been from the beginning, calm, lit from within, the gaze of one who had long since surrendered to a higher audience than the press or the public. When he spoke, his words cut through the charged silence with the clarity of a bell at dawn. The gospel, Leo said, voice rich with the resonance of truth, was never meant to make us comfortable. A pause, heavy, deliberate. It was meant to make us holy. A stillness deeper than before settled over the room. Not even Marco moved. For this was no policy debate now. No game of words. It was a call to the marrow, a summons to the ancient cost of discipleship. And then, without haste, without flourish, Leo spoke again. In that spirit, he said, voice unbroken, hear the final steps we must now take. He drew a breath, not as one weary, but as one solemn, charged with purpose. Eighth, a new spiritual renewal focus for all clergy. Annual retreats shall be mandatory. No priest, no bishop, no cardinal shall minister without first renewing his soul in silence and in prayer. A current swept through the room, one of both relief and conviction. The wounds of a weary clergy had long been whispered. Now they were named, and a bomb was commanded. 9th, increased transparency for the Vatican archives. That which has been hidden must be weighed in the light. Our history must serve as a mirror, not a mask. The word struck hard. Too many secrets had marred the Church's witness, too long had darkness been allowed sanctuary beneath sacred roofs. And then, quietly, as though pronouncing a final benediction upon all that had been spoken. 10th, the official Vatican recognition and promotion of acts of mercy worldwide. No act of compassion shall go unnamed. No work of love shall go uncelebrated. The Church must be known first and last for the mercy of her Lord. And with that, the Pope fell silent. No flourish. No defense. Only the unshaken stillness of a man who had said what must be said. Across the room, Marco Salvetti opened his mouth, then closed it. The words would not come. For what argument remains when the air itself is thick with the scent of truth? The cameras still rolled. The pens still hovered. Yet for a moment, the press room of the Vatican was transformed. Not a battlefield of ideologies, but a quiet sanctuary where hearts, shaken and stirred, weighed what had just been laid before them. Even Marco's gaze had softened, not in surrender, but in recognition. Here was no politician. No mere reformer. Here stood a shepherd, one who had counted the cost and paid it willingly. If you believe the gospel was never meant to make us comfortable, but to make us holy, then subscribe now and join this awakening. But if you still won't, ask yourself. What comfort are you unwilling to lose? Speak it below. For the call remains. The silence that now hung over the Vatican press room was unlike any that had come before. It was no longer the charged stillness of confrontation, nor the wary hush of political calculation. It was something older. Deeper. The kind of silence that settles when truth has been spoken, and hearts must now reckon with it. Pope Leo XIV let the stillness breathe. His gaze moved slowly across the room. Not in triumph, but in quiet searching, as if to meet each soul in turn. When he spoke again, the edge of fire had softened, not diminished, but tempered into a pastoral warmth that seemed to gather the entire chamber beneath unseen wings. This, Leo said, voice lower now, laden with compassion, is not about factions. He paused, letting the words settle like balm upon old wounds. It is about faith. A single breath passed, a sacred pause before a world still listening. For too long, he continued, gaze now lifted beyond the cameras, beyond the marble, toward the unseen multitudes watching across the earth, the bride of Christ has been known in the eyes of many for her power. The words ached with the weight of their truth. But the Church, Leo said, voice swelling with a gentle fervor, must be known, for her mercy. It was not a plea. It was not an apology. It was a call, a quiet command sent forth to the corners of a weary, divided world. Mercy. Not politics. Mercy, not pride. Mercy, not fear. And beneath those words, something shifted, not in marble or gold, but in hearts. In that moment, the eyes of Cardinal Tagle, long shadowed with conflict, glistened. His hands, which had clasped the rosary so tightly moments before, now released their grip, not in resignation, but in surrender to a higher unity. Without a word, the cardinal rose. The cameras turned as one, lenses whirring, flashes poised. But Tagle did not glance toward them. His steps were not for spectacle, but for witness. He crossed the space between them, each step a quiet renunciation of division. And there, before the watching world, he embraced Leo, not with ceremony, but with the simple, unguarded embrace of a brother who had chosen faith over fear. No words passed between them. None were needed. For in that moment, two shepherds stood as one, bearing the weight of a church called back to its first love. The room remained hushed. Marco Salvetti, hands now still upon his notes, lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in an unspoken acknowledgement of a truth he had not come to find, but had found him. And beyond those ancient walls, across screens and hearts, the world watched, many with eyes blurred, many with hearts stirred, many with questions that would not let them go. If you believe that the Church must be known not for her power, but for her mercy, then subscribe now and walk with us on this path of awakening. But if you still won't, what is it within you that resists the call of mercy? Speak it below. For the path remains open, and the shepherd still calls. The embrace between Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Tagle lingered in the sacred stillness, two figures joined not by agreement alone, but by the deeper covenant of faith. Across the vast web of screens through which millions now watched, hearts stirred. Some with hope. Some with fear. Some with the unspoken ache of conviction long resisted. And when the two men parted, their silent accord left a weight upon the room, a weight that no argument could dislodge. There were no more questions from Marco Salvetti. His pen remained poised, his eyes lowered, not in concession to power, but in reverence before something deeper than power. As the cameras prepared to fade, the voice of the unseen narrator rose, not to explain, but to invite. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Would you have joined the chorus of skepticism? Or stood beneath the banner of mercy? Would you have clung to comfort, or leaned into the calling of truth? Such questions cannot be answered with mere words. They demand the reckoning of the heart. And as this moment now settles into the fabric of history, let us carry its echo beyond the walls of Rome, into our lives, our choices, our witness. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake applause for anointing. If you walk with us, not for stories, but for awakenings, then subscribe now to God's message for souls. But if you still will not, then write below, what truth here stirred you, or scared you, today. For the shepherd still calls. And the path remains open.